Aaron Rupar, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, what an awful experience, Aaron. Could you just take us through your memories, your experience of what happened on the day of that awful shooting?
Yeah, it was 1 week ago today, right around now, in fact, maybe an hour earlier in the day. We went to drop off our kids that morning at the Annunciation School in South Minneapolis. It was actually only their third day of school. So, I mean, this was a very new community for us, a new school environment, and dropped the kids off. Didn't really think anything of it, of course. And by the time we got back home, we only lived about a mile away from the campus there. We heard just an unending string of sirens racing toward that area. And even then, I didn't really think anything of it in terms of, my mind never went to, oh boy, did something bad happen at the school. I just assumed it was like a car wreck or something like that. But around this same time, I got a text from a friend of mine saying, "Hey man, have you heard what's going on at Annunciation?" And that was the first that I had connected the dots that something might be going on there. And of course, right away my heart sank. Kind of started feeling, almost nauseous with anxiety. We hopped in the car, drove down there as quickly as we could. We got there very promptly before police had totally set up a perimeter, so we were able to kind of walk up to the school. And one of the first kids that we encountered was my son, who's in preschool there. So we scooped him up, and then the next hour or so of my life was probably the worst hour I've experienced because we didn't know what had happened to our daughter, who was in the school with all the other kids, and of course there were parents kind of congregating outside the school. We
Mm.
had heard that up to 20 kids had been shot, and there were fatalities, and so it's like the worst kind of waiting game, to try and find out if your kid is among the ones who was hurt. Eventually, they let the parents into the gym where kids were being held, who were unharmed, and thankfully my daughter was there. So you had kind of that wave of relief, when you realize that she was okay. But then, pretty quickly your mind kind of turns to the kids and the families who weren't, the kids who will never come home after that day. And
Yes.
since then, the past week, it's really been just kind of a lot of processing. Initially there's kind of a state of shock that you're in, and kind of the anger and just the full gamut of grief. And so here we are a week later. I'm still kind of processing it. The kids are still obviously out of school, but unlike anything that I've ever lived through, and hopefully never have to live through anything like that again.
Absolutely, the stuff of any parent's nightmare. How old are your children, Aaron? The boy and your little daughter.
Yeah, our youngest is 3, so he's in preschool, and then our daughter is 5 and in kindergarten.
Wow. And what are their memories of what happened there? Did they have they talked about it since? I mean, what how it struck them?
Thankfully, they really escaped the worst of it, because there's something like 350 kids in that school, and out of the 350, there were like 300 that were in the church where the shooting occurred. So you can imagine even the kids who weren't injured or killed, are emerging from that with a lot of trauma. We saw kids there when we were picking up our children after the shooting who had blood caked all over them, some who were breaking down crying,
Mm.
over what they had witnessed. Our kids were not yet in the church, in part because they are, younger. The kids who are already there were the older grade levels. And so, they certainly have a recognition that something unusual happened that day. They're very confused why we were there to pick them up. And, we've tried to kind of explain to them that a bad person did bad things, and, kind of kept it on that level without, trying to kind of go out of our way to traumatize them by getting into too many details. Now, when they return to school, I'm sure that, the educators there and administrators and other students will have conversations with them. And, I'm sure as time goes by, they'll have some sense of, kind of how terrible that day was, and in some ways how fortunate they are that they emerged from it unharmed. But I
Yeah.
think thankfully, in the spectrum of kids who were there, our kids came out on the side of being sort of less traumatized just because they were not physically there. They were nearby, but not in the church when the shooting occurred.
Yeah, but it's a mercy from the point of view of your family that your children were not caught up in of the worst of that terrible day. Other families, of course, were not so lucky. But it would have had an effect on you, Aaron, on your thinking. I guess there's a limit to what you could do any differently from now on and in future. But I guess you would have reflected on questions such as school security and general safety, gun control, those sort of things. How has it impacted your thinking on those things?
Yeah, and that's, one of the kind of sad ironies of this is, we moved into the city here in Minneapolis just 3 days before the shooting occurred on Sunday into this house that we're in now. And so, moving into the city from the suburbs, one of the things that we were mindful of was, the safety of our kids in schools. And we were very intentional about picking a school for them that we thought, not only would be good educationally, but would have good security, kind of be in a safe part of town, and seem to, have a strong community. And Annunciation has all those things, but that's been one of the lessons I've kind of been forced to take from this is that, here in the United States, you can't really run and hide from things like this unless you want to basically homeschool your children, whether it's a public school, private school, religious school. Just given the culture of gun violence that we have here, you're kind of taking a chance no matter what. And so I can't really beat myself up or, myself and my spouse, we're not really second guessing too much because, it really just does kind of feel like, unfortunately, this was our day for something like this to happen, tragically. And it could have been a lot worse from the standpoint of our family. But,
Mm,
this is something that, as a journalist, I've covered, many shootings like this over the past 15 years or so. And there was that element of kind of it feeling surreal to actually live through it. It's one thing to talk to survivors or be there nearby when a shooting happens and kind of see it from a distance, but when you're actually there as a parent, other parents are hysterical and crying, and there was that element of kind of disbelief that I was actually living through something that I had covered as a journalist so many times. So again, I can't really beat ourselves up too much. I think we had the right kind of, thought process and decision tree in choosing the school for our kids.
mm,
And, I know law enforcement and the administrators there did everything they could to minimize the damage and to, kind of keep it contained once it was clear that a terrible tragedy was unfolding. But, this is a thing for our policymakers. It's kind of a tired conversation, unfortunately, at this point.
mm.
But the problem in the United States is that we're so awash in guns that if someone has mental illness and they want to take that on other people, they have ways to do that where they can inflict mass casualties in just a matter of seconds because of the guns that are available to them. And the shooter here purchased them legally, which allowed the shooter to fire something like 150 rounds in just a matter of seconds. And when you really consider why America has this problem and other countries do not,
Yes.
to me, that is the variable that deserves the most attention.
Yes, oh, you say it is an exhausted conversation in the United States where you are, and as you know, I mean, so much of this discussion about school security and gun control just sounds so alien to so many British ears. Although in this country there are questions about guns in our big cities, in inner city areas, and so on. It's not an entirely alien conversation, but the idea of school security, school police, even discussions about arming teachers. That just sounds so surreal here.
Yeah, and this was something that Trump talked about during his first term, and he brought it up again yesterday. This idea that you could have some teachers who are ex-military, but there's limits to that because again, this shooter in this particular case at the Annunciation Church walked up and started firing through glass windows. And so, what if you're going to go the school security route, are you supposed to turn churches and schools into basically fortresses that are completely
Mm,
bulletproof, where every entrance has some sort of armed guard? I mean, it's just not viable or sustainable, at scale to do that. And, these are the conversations that especially our Republican elected officials have here to avoid having the more consequential but politically fraught discussion about guns. And, again, I think people have gotten unfortunately kind of beaten down in this country because, we've had school shootings like this on an almost yearly basis now, back 15, 20 years, not even to mention all the mass shootings that happen outside of schools. And yet, Republicans here win elections. And so, it's really up to the voters to, kind of make better decisions in terms of if we want to have a society where, like the UK, like other developed countries who don't have mass shootings almost every single day, then it's up to us to elect representatives who will take this issue seriously and not talk about school security or arming teachers, but talk about guns because that is the variable that sets us apart.
Aaron, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.